The Pentagon releases a report saying that China's military wants to double its nukes this decade. Why has the U.S. emphasized China's military strength while omitting their own? 2 Chinese COVID-19 vaccines make an appearance in Beijing. Is China leading the charge in producing a COVID-19 vaccine? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Li Qiuyuan, sitting in for Liu Xin. On September the 1st, the Pentagon released an annual report saying that China is planning to double its nuclear warheads this decade. The report added that China has the world's largest navy and that China's military spending exceeds its economic strength. The paper neglected the U.S.'s own overwhelming military power. So, what is the U.S.'s motivation behind releasing this information? Also in August, U.S. Secretary of Defense Mark Esper said the Pentagon is prepared for China, claiming that China's military serves Beijing's authoritarian goals. What is the truth here? Well, joining us in Beijing, we have Mr. Zhao Tong, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie-Tsinghua Center for Global Policy, and from Florida in the United States, Dr. Ivan Eland, Senior Fellow at the Independent Institute. Great to see you both. So here's the latest. The day after the report was released, China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson said China is firmly opposed to those improper comments on China's national defense and deliberate distortion of China's strategic intentions. China's Defense Ministry also said the Pentagon report is fraught with a zero-sum game mindset and Cold War mentality. It hyped up the so-called Chinese military threat and misinterpreted China's national defense policy and military strategies. So this is the statement coming out from China. This is the response from China. But Dr. Eland, let me start with you. This is the first time the United States military has disclosed China's nuclear warhead count. Why has the U.S. disclosed China's nuclear capability in this annual report in particular?
Well, I think they're hoping to shame, if you will, or entice China into, more or less shame China into a three-way arms control negotiation that the U.S. and Russia will likely have and make it serious at some point. So I think they're trying to get China into that, and the absolute number of warheads that China has right now is not the issue. They feel that China, if it were left out of this arrangement, they could rapidly increase their warheads, and of course the other 2 countries would have to stay within the whatever limits they come up with. So this would be a disadvantage for the other 2 countries, and therefore they're trying to get China into these nuclear talks, disarmament.
And the timing of it, Dr. Eland, the analysis comes as the U.S. is in nuclear talks with Russia ahead of the expiration of the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, Nuclear Pact. Now, this is a 2010 treaty signed between the United States and Russia to halve their number of strategic nuclear missile launchers. Any implications about the timing? What do you think, Dr. Eland?
Well, I think, yes, that's what's driving is the talks between Russia and the U.S. If you're having disarmament and you leave out a major country, you know, they have the potential to escalate their spending on nuclear warheads, missiles, etc. And so, as I say, the Chinese still have a low number of warheads compared to the U.S. and Russia. It's the potential for growth that really is the issue with trying to get China into the talks.
And Professor Zhao, let me get your take on this report. In fact, according to the Defense News, the U.S. has an estimated 3,800 warheads ready for action and more in reserve. The Pentagon report says that China currently has about 200 nuclear warheads. How did they uncover this figure? I mean, is the United States exaggerating China's nuclear strength or not?
Well, I think the Chinese reaction to the American reporting of Chinese nuclear number is mixed. If you listen to people like Hu Xijin, the chief editor of Global Times, he thinks that the U.S. is actually deliberately understating Chinese nuclear capability in order to undermine the credibility of Chinese nuclear deterrent. But in either case, I think one positive side of the DoD report is the first time that the U.S. officially reveals its estimate of Chinese nuclear stockpile, which is a little more than 200, and that's far lower than most of the open source estimates. So which shows the U.S. is willing to face the fact, and that provides a good foundation for future meal-to-meal interaction. But the negative aspect of the report is the U.S. seems to continue its previous tradition of exaggerating China's future trend of nuclear buildup. It claims that China would double its nuclear arsenal in 10 years. That may not happen, and it's important to note that whether China will build up its nuclear forces in the future is also affected by American nuclear policy. Given that U.S. has more than 3,800 active nuclear weapons, I think if U.S. is really interested in engaging China in arms control discussions, the U.S. has to come up with a strategy to address the huge power asymmetry between the two militaries.
Yeah, this is an extremely intriguing report. Now, the warheads is one part. Naval capability was also mentioned in this report. It suggests that China has already achieved parity with or even exceeded the U.S. in several military modernization areas, such as shipbuilding, the development of ballistic and cruise missiles, as well as integrated air defense systems. And on the Navy, for example, the report says that China has the largest Navy in the world, with an overall battle force of approximately 350 ships and submarines, including over 130 major surface combatants. And in comparison, the United States Navy's battle force is approximately 293 ships as of early 2020. But in this regard, Forbes News point out that the statistic is somewhat misleading. Dr. ELAND, let's look at this. The report says although China has more warships than the United States Navy, the American fleet is ahead in tonnage due to having larger warships, including 11 aircraft carriers that weigh in at 100,000 tons apiece. What is your perspective on this? I mean, how large is the gap between the Chinese Navy and the American Navy? Is the United States lagging behind, as the Pentagon report suggested?
No, I don't think it is. In fact, I think the U.S. is way ahead. Now, there is the potential for an asymmetric occurrence could happen in any war. Maybe the U.S. has incorrectly invested in aircraft carriers, which are huge tonnage. But tonnage anymore is a bad measure of whether your Navy is capable or not. And the number of ships is even worse because as warships have gone along, they've become much more expensive and much more capable, so you can buy fewer of them. The U.S. ships are the best they've ever been relatively and absolutely as far as naval power goes. They have multiple systems, attack systems, defense systems, anti-submarine systems, etc. So what you really need to do is look at capabilities, not number or tonnage. And one of the things that about the U.S. military, they're maybe the only military in the world who badmouths their capabilities to get more money. Most militaries, and this is what they should do, brag excessively about their capabilities to deter and scare other militaries. Ours doesn't do that. Every spring it comes along and says, we need more money and we're falling behind. So they do these simulations, and you can't get a lot with a simulation. You get some information, but of course their simulations say that the Chinese would win a battle. But I think that's ridiculous. The U.S. Navy is in the Chinese littoral area, not the reverse. So we have an offensively built Navy to intervene around the world, and China is gaining in military strength, and they're spending more money, but they're nowhere equal to being a global power yet, at least in the military area. Certainly economically, China is much more advanced and is a global power. And you know, China may eventually become a global power militarily as well, because they'll have the money to do so. Whether they choose to do it or not is an open question. But right now, the U.S. still has military superiority over China.
I'll also talk about military budget. I mean, the Pentagon report says that China continues to boost its military spending at a rate that exceeds Chinese economic growth, and Beijing's published military budget omits several major categories of expenditures, including research and development and foreign weapons procurement. That's from the Pentagon report. Professor ZHAO, let me give you a chance to respond to what's been said there. I mean, China's foreign ministry spokesperson said the U.S. spends as much on its military as the next 10 countries combined. To be precise here, China's military spending for 2020 is $178 billion US dollars, while the U.S. own budget is $738 billion US dollars. Why is the United States concerned so much about China when their own budget is far greater, Professor?
Well, I think the key issue here is the U.S. is a global military power. It has clear commitments not only to defending its own territorial integrity, but also to defending its allies and friends. And China certainly, its military ambition is limited. It's primarily aiming at defending its territorial integrity and protecting its growing economic interests in other parts of the world. So for the United States, as we just discussed, even though the U.S. naval power is still much stronger than China's, its big surface ships, the number of those big battleships are larger than China, and they are more technologically advanced. But the U.S. still worries that China can somehow obtain a regional military superiority or some military advantage in the theater of Asia-Pacific. But the U.S., despite its global power, it can only concentrate a small portion of its global military power to the Asia-Pacific region. So it worries that in this specific geographical area, it may add an increasing military disadvantage. The similar happens to the military budget. China has less than $200 billion military budget. The U.S. has about 700, and the U.S. budget is much bigger than many other countries combined. And the Chinese military budget only constitutes less than 2% of its GDP, whereas the U.S. budget constitutes about 4%. But the U.S. worries about its capability to distribute enough military resources to the Asia-Pacific region. So the key point is whether the two big powers can build a common understanding on what right balance of military power in the Asia-Pacific region will look like, how they can reach a satisfactory peace regime in this region near China, especially around the first island chain. That's the area where the two militaries should work at.
Now, we've got some commentary piece from both, Chinese news media outlets and United States media outlets. Let's take a look at the China ones first. A South China Morning Post article titled "Don't Be Fooled by the U.S. Claims of Chinese Military Superiority" says that in a repeat of Cold War-style propaganda, Washington and some of its allies are working to create an impression that China could prevail in a war with America in the Asia-Pacific, thereby creating an excuse for a greater U.S.-led military buildup. Dr. Eland, what do you think after hearing this? Portraying China as a powerful threat while neglecting its own capabilities to some extent.
Well, I have no doubt that the Pentagon budget tiers are playing these types of games because they used to play this with the Soviets during the Cold War. But the Congress came back with an interesting question of the admirals and generals at the congressional hearing, the congressional budget hearing. They would say, well, if the Soviet military is so big and wonderful, would you trade it for the U.S. military? And then there was a lot of hemming and hawing because the Congress knew what the Pentagon was trying to do, and that is, pump up the threat so they can get more money. And they still do that, and they're still doing that. Now, is there a possibility that China could win a war in that area? Yes, I agree. They have local superiority, just like the Russians do in the Baltics and that sort of thing. And also, there could be asymmetric means of using missiles to destroy the carriers. I'm not a big proponent of the carriers because you may need some of them, but I think it's so vulnerable. These ships, surface ships, are vulnerable to aircraft, missiles, etc. That I think they're probably going to have to put a lot of this underwater in submarines. And I think the U.S. Navy is behind on that. We have the most capable submarines, but we still have too much surface ship vulnerability, particularly the carriers. And I'm always been skeptical that they can survive. But as far as offensive capability around the world, if you want to have a global power, you almost have to have aircraft carriers. But I prefer a scale back U.S. military so that the U.S. can use it for its economy and that sort of thing, because I think we're overextended. We have about 35% of the world's military spending and about 12% of the world's GDP. So I think if any country, if we accuse China of being spending too much military for their situation, the United States certainly does that to a much greater extent. And I think most empires decline because of their overextension and the financial difficulties that occurs.
And here's what Wall Street Journal is saying on a related matter. It published an article of U.S. Secretary of Defense Mark Esper titled "The Pentagon is Prepared for China." At the very beginning of this article, Esper said that we have entered a new era of global competition between the free and open international order and an authoritarian system fostered by Beijing. And he continued to caution that PLA modernization is a trend the world must study and prepare for, much like the United States and the West studied and addressed the Soviet armed forces in the 20th century. Professor ZHAO, are we in such an era described by Mark Esper?
Well, I think that his statement certainly reflects a broad concern within the U.S. security community that if the current trend continues, China might be able to acquire increasing military advantage in the Asia-Pacific region. Esper is particularly worried that the nature of the Chinese military, the political system, I think it's important to recognize that in the Chinese system, the party controls the gun. That's an unequivocal principle of the Chinese system. That's a reality that people have to deal with rather than to wish away. And if the U.S. would like to build a stable meal-to-meal relationship with China, then the bilateral discussion has to be based on that factual basis. But recognizing that fact, it's also important to note that there are also growing common interests in the security area between the two big powers. Despite their military competition, they have a growing interest in making sure that their military competition wouldn't escalate inadvertently to higher levels, or even to to cross the nuclear threshold. They have a common interest in making sure that their military competition do not become too costly, especially in the post-COVID-19 era. Both nations will face huge financial constraints. There is it's in neither country's interest to have a costly arms race. So I think there are still important areas for the two militaries to work in.
Definitely, but to be fair, Esper is rare within the Trump administration to express willingness to visit China and strengthen communication within this year. But portraying China as an overwhelming rival to the United States, how can that visit be achieved is still a question. We'll be keep watching this. Thank you very much to my guests, Professor ZHAO Tong, Senior Fellow, Carnegie-Tsinghua Center for Global Policy, and Dr. Ivan ELAND, Senior Fellow at the Independent Institute.